Welcome back to The Ripple Effect, where we break down the headlines and explore their deeper impact. Today, we're launching a two-part series covering two of the most pressing geopolitical issues of 2025. In part one, we focus on Ukraine, shifting European politics and NATO's evolving role in regional security. With key elections in Germany, Poland, and Romania coming, Europe's unity is under strain, and discussions of a post-war peacekeeping force are gaining traction. Meanwhile, the UK's defense posture is shifting as it navigates its role between the US and Europe. In part two, we'll turn to critical minerals, China's dominance over supply chain, Western efforts to secure independence, and how this impacts everything from defense to energy. To unpack today's discussion, I'm delighted to welcome back Sir Michael Fallon, former UK Defense Secretary, and my co-host, Nicholaus Rohleder. Let's start with the Ukraine. Nicholaus, over to you.
Sir Michael, it's great to see you. Thank you for coming on with us.
Pleasure.
So shifting to the situation in Ukraine, obviously we have a turnover in administration in the United States, which is critical here. Looking at the rhetoric that Donald Trump has offered, both on the campaign trail and since he's been in office with a flurry of executive orders over the last week, ranging from pressuring Ukraine to lower the conscription age to bolster its stance on the front lines, and then possibly shifting towards even more punitive sanctions on Russia's energy industry. What do you think the appropriate response of NATO at large is to put Ukraine in a position of strength relative to where it is now?
Well, first thing to say, and thank you for inviting me, is the war goes on. The war isn't waiting for Trump. The fighting is going on. The Russians are still fighting. The Ukrainians are desperately trying to hold on to more bits of their territory. So while we're waiting for the new administration to make its final judgment, there's plenty to be done to helping Ukraine, and that's what we're focused on in Europe, and we should be doing more of. They're desperately short of shells, they're short of all kinds of military equipment, and there's plenty for us to be doing to make sure that Putin doesn't take any more of Ukraine's territory and can, where possible, be pushed back. Now, while we're waiting for the American decision, of course, it follows the election. There's a famous saying, you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. I think President Trump first said he would stop the war in 24 hours. He's now slightly mitigated that and said it's going to take some time to sort out. And of course it is. But it's important that we keep the pressure up on Russia. And there is plenty of different ways of doing that. We can increase sanctions. The Russian war effort is being paid by the oil that they're selling. They're still selling it on the open market. They're tankering it around the world. There is plenty more we can be doing to increase the stranglehold on the Russian economy and to make their war in Ukraine more difficult than it is at the moment.
There's been some initial rhetoric that's come back from the Russian government. From your perspective, where do you think that their red lines are as we shift into what Donald Trump has presumably situated to the American public as an inevitable peace negotiation? There's been a bit of back and forth there. I feel like the American perspective is a bit different than the European perspective. I'd be curious to your thoughts on this.
Yes, nobody wants this war to go on. Wars have to end in the end. People are being killed every day, and the president is quite right about that. We need to bring this war to an end. Ukraine wants it to end, and certainly I think Russia, in the end, is paying an enormous price, not just in terms of men being killed and wounded on the front in Ukraine, but also an enormous price in terms of its economy and the extent to which it's locked out of the international financial system. So there is growing interest now in how this is brought about. What are the red lines on either side? Well, Russia clearly will want to keep most of what it's gained, including Crimea, which has previously been part of Russia since 2014. And so far as the Ukraine is concerned, they will want to make sure whatever agreement is reached, that it really will hold. There was an agreement last time, by the way, after the invasion of Crimea, called the Minsk Accords. France and Germany were involved, and it collapsed. And Russia, of course, came back 8 years later to invade the whole of Ukraine. So the interest here in Europe will be finding an agreement that is durable and doesn't allow anything like this to break out ever again.
And to some of those points, the isolation of Russia is far more severe than it was during the years of Crimea and the period that followed. And I think that to some of the points made there, the Russian population has been broadly shut out of the global economy. It's far different than it was prior. And I think that to a certain degree, if you look at how Putin has styled his regime, that's a really critical weakness. And to that same point, there's not really a shared value system between the Russians and their key allies, such as the Chinese, as you see with the Europeans, where you have Russians living in London, in Paris, in Frankfurt. And so it'll be interesting to see how they rejoin the world if they're even invited to do so on the tail end of a peace negotiation. And to the point of a lasting peace, there's been a lot of discussion of a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine as a byproduct of negotiations. What do you make of that? There's been a discussion of as much as 80,000. The kind of probe by Zelensky. There's been a lot of dialogue. Emmanuel Macron has supported this notion as well. Can you unpack that for us? What do you think?
Well, first, to take your first point, the sanctions are there, and there's going to have to be, underpinning any agreement, some kind of snapback, that we don't simply give Russia back all its frozen assets from the international banking system straight away, that we don't simply relax some of the sanctions on oil and gas, that there is a step-by-step progress to this, and there is an instant snapback if we have any Russian breach of the agreement that is reached, or any further Russian destabilization of Ukraine. So that's extremely important. So the sanctions, in a way, need to be toughened, but they need to be made ready so they can roll again. So far as the population is concerned, of course, it is still true that middle-class Russians can travel. They can holiday in Europe. They can buy property in London. And again, I think that's something the West is going to have to look at. Is it really right that younger Russians should be able to lie on the beaches of Europe while younger Ukrainians are going out there and dying for their country? So we may have to look again when we do get to an agreement as to what kind of sanctions are appropriate. Now, your second question was, how do we make sure that this peace holds along the line of control, or the point at which the fighting is stopped, or where the agreement is reached on how far back Russian forces should go? And that will involve troops on the ground. And we've been here before. We've done that in Bosnia. The Americans and others have helped us do that in Korea. There's plenty of experience there. But in the end, it's going to need a lot of troops. It's a very big country. It's likely to be a very long border to police. And it's going to have to require, properly armed troops that aren't simply peacekeepers with berets, but armed troops ready to repel any further incursion. And that may well involve some of the major European militaries, for example, the British or the French. Whether or not the Russians would be prepared to have American troops facing across their lines, I know Zelensky would welcome that. Whether the Russians would, I think, is a very moot question.
And shifting to the UK, it's as historically the closest ally to the US, with one of the higher defense expenditures within NATO, in really a changing Europe with renewed conflict having returned to the continent. How do you think about, especially in the wake of Donald Trump coming into the White House, the UK as an intermediary between the US and Europe from a defense perspective? Because I think that there are a couple of things there, in the sense that Donald Trump has put himself out to be a pro-British president. He has historical linkages and significant investments in the UK, and also to a certain degree, the UK is an extremely strategic ally of the US, as previously mentioned, and most people don't realize a key jumping off point in the event there's a conflict anywhere on the continent. So I'd be curious to how you think about the evolving role of the UK as a defense player in Europe, in a changing Europe, and kind of how that position really in between the US and the EU is going to look in the coming years.
Well, we're going to come under pressure, I think, to justify our bridging role, if you like. Yes, we have a nuclear deterrent alongside the American and French deterrents. Yes, we're a good ally of the West. We played our part in the coalition against the Daesh in the Middle East. And yes, we're involved in AUKUS in strengthening lethality in Indo-Pacific to resist any potential Chinese aggression. But to do all that, we do need to increase our defense budget. And some of the other European countries have now been increasing their budgets faster. Poland now spends far more on defense than Britain does. So we have a defense review underway at the moment. We're spending 2.3%. That's nowhere near what Poland is spending, nowhere near what the Americans are spending, but it is ahead of most of the pack in Europe. And there is a leadership role, I think, there for Britain, traditionally the senior military partner of the United States in Europe. There's a leadership role that we have to now justify. And that means, at a very difficult time for our public finances, that means increasing our defense spending. The government has committed to 2.5%, but hasn't yet set a timetable on it. And if you want to set that in historical context, Nicholas, if you go back to the start of this century, 25 years ago, long before Russian aggression, long before conflict in the Middle East, long before 9/11, Britain was spending 2.7% in a much more peaceful time. So we are underspending, we're under pressure now, and we should be increasing our spend and leading others in Europe to do the same.
And as a closing point here, do you believe that, you know, I know that the transition to higher defense spending and renewed defense capabilities in Europe is going to take some time, and there's going to be friction, especially on the continent. How do you feel that in the wake of the Ukraine situation, the British public feels about this, and how strongly do you think that they believe that a renewed defense presence needs to be compulsory on a future basis relative to what's been done over the last 10 to 15 years?
It's often said in European politics that there are no votes in defense, that the European voters don't put defense in their top 5 or 6 priorities. But we've seen now, you know, firsthand what Russia's been doing in recent years. We've had a Russian attack in one of our cathedral cities, a poisoning in Salisbury. We've seen what Russia has done in Crimea. Last week, we had Russian ships, spy ships, going through the English Channel, spying on our underwater infrastructure. So I think the public here are very aware now, more aware than they were, you know, for a long time, perhaps since the Cold War, of just what a threat Russia poses. And secondly, I think there's been a huge amount of sympathy here for the plight of Ukraine. A lot of villages and towns welcomed refugees from Ukraine. It's been an awful lot of fundraising. And really, alongside Poland and other countries, you know, Britain has led the way in trying to help Ukraine. So to answer your question, you know, it's a responsibility for the politicians now to educate the public that alongside all the other pressures to spend more on welfare, to spend more on the health service, and so on, alongside that, you've got to keep your people safe. And nothing else really as important as that. I always give the example of climate change. I'm sure Ukraine signed up to the climate change targets, but that's of no use if your country isn't safe, if it's being invaded, if it's not being properly protected. So defense has to come before everything else.
Thank you, Sir Michael. And I think that, you know, to close this out, you know, the shift to a renewed defense posturing in Europe is going to take some time. But I think that, you know, despite some of the rhetoric that's put out in the U.S., you know, some of the news that's been out there to date, I think that things are getting on the right path, and I'm optimistic that we'll find an amicable solution in the coming months, and, you know, can really build a long-term deterrent in the UK, on the continent, and get the Americans on board with that. Liz, over to you here.
Yeah, thank you. I think just one final question on that point, Michael. With the German election coming up, there's rumored to be 40% of Germans don't believe in continuing to support the war. There's funding fatigue, and so on. How is that going to impact, you know, how we move forward?
Well, it's going to require leadership, and you don't have leadership in Germany at the moment because it's a coalition that's got stuck. That's why they're now having an election. I hope the centre-right will take over the government, perhaps in a new coalition, and I hope they will, you know, revive the importance that Russia does not win in Ukraine, because it has huge implications for the countries around Ukraine, for the Black Sea countries, for the Baltic states, and all of that in the end will affect Germany. So there's again a job of political leadership to be done in Germany. everybody's weary with the war. Ukraine, particularly, obviously, they're the ones fighting it, and it's got to come to an end at some point. But we've got to make sure that Ukraine comes out of it as well as possible, and secondly, that it can't be triggered again.
Sir Michael, Nicholaus, thank you so much for your insights. And to our audience, if you found this discussion valuable, please be sure to subscribe to The Ripple Effect for more insights and deep dives into the issues shaping our world. Thanks again.